The closing happened on a Tuesday in March. 32-year-old Kate Howell stood in the corner of an empty living room, holding a manila folder that contained her entire financial future. Through the west-facing windows, spring sunlight poured in like liquid gold, illuminating dust particles that danced in the quiet air. Outside, birds sang. Inside, Kate's heart hammered against her ribs. She was holding the deed to 847 Birchwood Lane, a three-bedroom colonial with original hardwood floors, a wraparound porch, and 30 years of a family's history embedded in its walls. But here's what most people don't understand about property ownership. A deed is just paper until you make it real. The signature line read, Silver Kestrel, LLC, by Kate Howell, managing member. This mattered. This mattered more than she could have possibly imagined. The attorney who closed the deal had smiled politely, shaken her hand, and wished her luck. Luck. As if purchasing your first home, strategically, carefully, without ever uttering the family name on the deed, was a matter of luck. It wasn't luck. It was survival instinct wrapped up in legal language and routed through an LLC structure that her financial advisor had insisted was the smart move. Keep it separate, he'd said. Keep it protected. She hadn't fully understood why she needed that level of protection until the moment she pulled up to the house with the keys in her hand and saw her mother's car already parked in the driveway. Elaine Whitaker had a talent for appearing places uninvited. She had a key that Kate had specifically not given her. She would later learn that this key had been given to Evan, who had given it to his wife Lily, who was too kind to say no, and Lily had mentioned it to Elaine, and Elaine had made a copy. Of course she had. Elaine had made copies of things her entire life, copies of Kate's report cards to show relatives, copies of Kate's therapy bills to prove to the family that Kate was difficult, copies of Kate's college acceptance letters to frame in the hallway as if she'd somehow earned them herself. But this time, Elaine didn't have a key to Kate's life, and this realization was going to change everything. Kate changed the locks within 6 hours of closing. The locksmith was a stocky man named Dennis who'd been in the business for 23 years. He asked no questions. He simply replaced the deadbolts, updated the security system, and provided her with 4 shiny new keys. 3 of these she placed in a safe deposit box. 1 she kept. As he was leaving, packing up his tools, he paused at the door and said something that Kate would replay in her mind hundreds of times over the coming months. Some people, he said, they'll test the locks before they've even paid you for the job. Kate nodded, though she didn't fully understand. But she would learn. She would learn. Very soon. The notice arrived the next morning, printed on cardstock, sealed in an envelope with her own return address printed in her own careful handwriting. She'd drafted it the night before, at 2 a.m., sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold and a legal template on her laptop. The notice was simple and absolute. It stated that Kate Howell, owner of the property at 847 Birchwood Lane, legally known as tax parcel number 4432B08, did hereby notify all parties that this was a private residence, no trespassing, no entry without written permission from the owner. All communications should be conducted via electronic mail only. The notice included her email address and nothing else. No explanation. No room for negotiation. She printed 15 copies and sent them via certified mail to every address she had for her parents, her brother, her sister-in-law. She sent it to the physical address of Whitaker Industries, the family business her father had built 40 years ago and still controlled with an iron fist. She sent it to Lily's office, though she felt guilty about that one. Lily had always been kind, but Lily had also stayed silent. Her mother's response came within hours. It came in the form of a photograph posted to Facebook. The image showed the front porch of Kate's new house, the welcome mat visible, the painted shutters she hadn't even gotten around to deciding whether to keep or replace. The caption read, So proud of our baby's new nest. The Whitaker family home is coming together beautifully. Can't wait until this becomes our gathering place. So blessed to have raised a daughter who makes her dreams come true. Kate screenshotted it and saved it to a folder on her computer labeled Evidence. She already knew she'd need it. What Kate would later understand, what she was only beginning to comprehend during this first week of ownership, was that she had made a fundamental violation of an unspoken family rule. She had created a boundary that didn't center the family's needs. She had created a lock that her parents didn't control. In the world that Kate had grown up in, the world that her father had built and her mother had maintained through careful social performance and strategic public displays of family unity, children didn't own things. They borrowed them. They inhabited them. They performed gratitude for them. But they didn't actually own them in a way that allowed them to exclude their parents. That wasn't how it worked. At least, that wasn't how it had ever worked before. The power company called on Friday. Someone had called requesting that the electricity be transferred from the name of the previous owner to Evan Whitaker, head of household. The representative on the phone was polite but firm. They required the owner's signature on the transfer form. Kate faxed over the deed, the one with her name and the LLC designation very clearly marked, and included a note requesting that if anyone contacted them, claiming to represent the property owner, they should verify directly with the number she provided. She followed up with an email to her parents. This email was professionally worded but unmistakable in its message. The utilities were in her name. Only she could make changes. Any unauthorized attempts to modify accounts would be noted and documented. She wasn't threatening. She was simply stating fact. This distinction mattered to her. She wasn't being aggressive. She was being clear. That night, sitting alone in her empty house, hearing the new locks secure and the new security system armed, Kate heard her mother's voice in her head. Not her mother's voice as it was now. Sharp, controlling, rehearsed for public consumption. But her mother's voice from when Kate was 7 years old. They had been moving into a new house. Kate's mother had taken her hand as they stood on the threshold, and she'd said something that had lodged itself in Kate's memory for 25 years. A house, her mother had said, is a place that knows your name. Not just your name written on documents, but your name spoken in love. A house that knows you. Kate had believed that then. She had wanted to believe it for most of her adult life, but as she lay in the dark, listening to the sound of the new locks, listening to the particular silence that a house makes when it belongs entirely to you and you're still not sure how to feel about it, Kate understood that her mother had lied. A house didn't have to know your name spoken in love. A house just had to know your name. That was enough. The love could come later, or it might not come at all. Either way, the house would still be yours. The first week ended with the power still in Kate's name and the locks still in her possession. The second week would bring lawyers. But for now, in this space between the old life and whatever was coming next, Kate walked through each empty room of her house and tried on the feeling of the place. She tried on ownership. She tried on the sensation of boundaries. She tried on the terrifying, thrilling concept of saying no to her parents and meaning it. She was still getting used to it. She was still learning the weight of keys, the significance of locks, the particular kind of love that manifests as protection. Not of the people you're supposed to love, but of yourself. It started with the locksmith again. Dennis, the man who'd changed the locks, called on a Tuesday morning. He'd been contacted by someone claiming to be the homeowner, someone who'd wanted to make changes to the security system. Dennis, bless him, had checked the paperwork and called Kate instead. Wanted to add an authorized set of keys, he'd explained. But the name didn't match your paperwork. The name was Martin Whitaker, her father. The confrontation Kate had been anticipating arrived on a gray Saturday, the kind of early April day that feels like it can't decide between winter and spring. She knew it was coming because Evan had texted her, a nervous text, apologetic in its brevity. "Dad's upset. He wants to talk about the house. Are you going to be home?" She'd responded that yes, she would be home. She was always going to be home. That was the point. When they arrived at the front door, her parents, her brother, and a locksmith they'd hired separately, Kate was standing behind the security chain, which she'd deliberately latched from the inside. She'd learned this from a self-defense class she'd taken in college, one of many things her parents had dismissed at the time. They'd paid for her to take it, then mocked her for being paranoid. Now, standing behind that chain with the door open barely 6 inches, Kate understood that paranoia and preparation were not opposites. They were sometimes the same thing. Behind the door, Kate had arranged her documentation carefully. She had the deed, laminated and placed in a clear folder. She had the transfer documents from the closing, which clearly indicated that the property was owned by Silver Kestrel, LLC, with Kate Howell as the managing member. She had her bank statements showing the down payment. She had the mortgage papers, the inspection reports, the insurance documents. She had everything that proved, without question, that this house belonged to her. She held this folder against her chest like armor. "Catherine." Her father's voice came through the chain as if it were a physical force. He hadn't called her by her full first name in years. This was his way of saying, "We are in a formal mode now. We are not in a family mode. We are in a business mode." But what he didn't understand was that she was fluent in his languages now. She knew exactly what he was trying to do. "You need to open this door. We need to have a conversation." "The conversation can happen through the door," Kate said. Her voice was steady. She'd practiced this. Not in front of a mirror because that would have seemed pathological, but in her car, on the way home from work. She'd practiced her tone, her phrasing, her responses to anticipated arguments. Or it can happen via email. Those are your options. Her brother Evan stepped closer to the door. Evan was 4 years older than Kate, and for most of their childhood, he'd been the family golden child. Good-looking, athletic, financially successful by the time he was 30. He'd married Lily, a woman everyone approved of, and they'd planned to have children immediately. Everything about Evan's life looked like the family's values had been correctly transmitted. Everything about his life looked like success. But Evan had never learned what Kate had slowly come to understand, that family approval and personal freedom were often inversely related. "Kate, come on," Evan said. "Dad just wants to talk. He's concerned about—" "I know what he's concerned about," Kate interrupted. Not unkindly, but firmly. She'd learned that being kind could be confused with being uncertain. "He's concerned that I've created a boundary he doesn't control. He's concerned that I've purchased a property in a way that doesn't include him. He's concerned that I'm demonstrating that I can make autonomous decisions. I understand his concern. I'm just not able to let it change my response to my own life." Her mother pushed forward now. Elaine Whitaker was a small woman, barely 5'2", but she moved through the world as if she took up significantly more space. She was dressed impeccably, as always, in cream-colored wool and gold jewelry that caught the weak spring sunlight. "Darling," she said, and Kate flinched at the endearment. She could hear the slight lisp in her mother's voice, the one that appeared whenever Elaine felt like she was losing control of a situation. That lisp meant desperation. That lisp meant her mother was afraid. "We just want to help. We just want to be part of this exciting new chapter. We're your family." "You are," Kate acknowledged, "but being family doesn't mean you get to treat my home as family property. This is different from before. Everything about this is different. I've made that clear in writing. I've sent the notices. I've had this conversation with the power company, with the insurance company, with everyone who might otherwise assume family members have a say. I'm drawing a line, and I need everyone to respect it. Deputy Rivera arrived about 45 minutes into the conversation. Kate had called the non-emergency line 15 minutes in, not to report a crime, but to have an official presence. She'd explained that family members were attempting to access her property against her wishes, and that she'd sent them a legal notice asking them to cease contact. She didn't want to escalate, she'd explained to the dispatcher. She just wanted documentation and an official understanding of the property lines. The deputy who arrived was a woman named Rivera, probably in her late 30s, with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested she'd dealt with family property disputes before. Deputy Rivera examined the deed, looked at the notice that Kate had printed and positioned in the front door's frame, and then looked at the people standing on the porch. "This is clearly her property," Rivera said. There was no hostility in her voice. There was also no ambiguity. "You folks need to leave. These are her boundaries, and they're legally backed. She's asked you not to be here, so you need to go." Kate's father looked for a moment as if he might argue. His face reddened and he opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Deputy Rivera repeated herself. "You need to go. Now." There was something in her voice that didn't leave room for negotiation. She was still professional. She was still polite. But she was also absolutely certain of the legal reality. Martin Whitaker turned and walked back to his car. That night, after they'd all left and Deputy Rivera had filed a report, and the house had fallen back into silence, Kate's mother posted to Facebook. The post was carefully worded, designed for plausible deniability. It talked about children who forget where they came from, about ingratitude, about the pain of aging parents who have given everything. The post didn't mention the house. It didn't mention Kate by name. It didn't mention the denied access or the police involvement. But everyone in the family network would understand what it meant. It was a performance, a public performance, designed to reframe the narrative. In this version of events, Kate wasn't protecting her boundaries. She was being cruel to her elderly parents. In this version of events, Kate wasn't asserting autonomy. She was demonstrating ingratitude. Kate screenshotted it. She would spend the evening creating a folder on her laptop organized by date and source. Screenshots from Facebook, text messages forwarded to her email, voicemail recordings saved as MP3 files. She was building a record. She didn't yet know what she'd use it for, but she understood that in any conflict with people this skilled at narrative control, documentation was the only weapon that mattered. Words could be reinterpreted, intentions could be questioned, but a timestamp, a URL, a text message sent from a known number, these were neutral observers. These were witnesses that couldn't be gaslighted. The invisible hands began their work that week. Kate would later learn that her father had hired a private investigator, a man named Chester, who'd apparently worked for Whitaker Industries for years doing various investigations the family preferred to keep separate from official channels. This investigator had accessed Kate's utility accounts by calling and claiming to be investigating fraud on behalf of the account holder's family. He'd also called Kate's credit card company with a similar story. He'd obtained her employment information from the city database under the guise of legal discovery. None of these actions were technically illegal, existing as they did in the gray space between privacy violation and determined family research. But they all represented the same thing: the invisible hands of a family determined to understand her situation so they could find a way to undermine it. Kate found out about the investigators' activities because one of the credit card company's representatives, a woman with a conscience, called her directly. "Ma'am," this woman had said carefully, "someone claiming to be your brother called and tried to access your account. I just wanted to verify that this is authorized contact." Kate had felt the blood drain from her face. They were escalating. They were using every resource they had. But they'd also made a mistake. They'd left a trail. She called Aaron Walsh that afternoon. Aaron was a real estate attorney, someone Kate had met through a colleague, and she'd been the person who'd guided Kate through the purchase process. More importantly, Aaron was a woman who understood the intersection of property law and family dysfunction. She'd done a lot of work with clients protecting assets from family claims, from siblings with financial problems, from parents who'd raised entitled children. Aaron's office was downtown, housed in a converted brownstone that somehow managed to look both professional and welcoming. When Kate walked in, slightly panicked and definitely furious, Aaron took one look at her and directed her toward a leather armchair and a cup of coffee, without asking questions. "Tell me everything," Aaron said. She had a notebook open and a pen poised, and Kate understood that this woman took threats to her clients' property rights with the seriousness they deserved. Kate told her everything. She told her about the notices, about the locksmith confrontation, about Deputy Rivera, about the Facebook post. And then she told her about the investigator, about the unauthorized access attempts, about the feeling that the family was circling, trying to find an angle, looking for some legal mechanism to lever her out of her own home. Aaron listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of validation. When Kate finished, Aaron set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. "What you're describing," Aaron said carefully, "is a family that's fundamentally struggling with a change in power dynamics. They're not used to you saying no. They're not used to you creating boundaries they can't ignore. And they're responding by trying to undermine your position through any means available to them. Some of these means are illegal. Some are just unethical. But here's what matters. You have documentation. You have proof of all of this. And documentation is going to be your protection." Over the following weeks, Aaron would help Kate construct a legal framework designed to protect her property from any action her family might take. She would help her establish that the LLC structure was legitimate, that the property transfer was properly executed, that Kate's attempts to maintain privacy and set boundaries were legally sound. She would also help Kate prepare for escalation, because both of them knew that this situation was nowhere near over. People who responded to boundaries by hiring investigators rarely accepted a simple no and moved on with their lives. The invisible hands kept reaching, kept trying to find purchase, kept searching for weakness. But Kate was no longer the person those hands had been designed to manipulate. She was learning to see what the hands were doing. She was learning to document their movements. She was learning that protection sometimes looked like isolation, and that isolation was a fair price to pay for control over your own life. The discovery of the fraud came through accident and preparation, which is how these things usually work. Kate had installed security cameras in her house, one pointing at the front door, one at the back entrance, one positioned to capture the driveway. She hadn't told anyone about these cameras. She was recording footage continuously, backing it up to cloud storage, creating a record of every moment the exterior of her property experienced. This was not paranoia. This was learned behavior. This was understanding that when you removed yourself from a system designed to exploit you, that system would show its true nature. The footage came in on a Tuesday. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m. In it, a figure could be seen walking up her driveway in the pre-dawn darkness. The figure was wearing a long coat and moved with careful deliberation, as if trying to minimize detection. As Kate watched the footage, her heart rate increased steadily. The figure approached the front door and appeared to slide something through the mail slot. Then the figure lingered for a moment, and the camera caught enough resolution that Kate could see it was her father. Martin Whitaker was at her house at 2:47 in the morning, sliding what appeared to be a document through her mail slot. Kate retrieved the document. It was printed on her father's business stationery, and it was titled Temporary Lease Agreement. In it, Her father had apparently drafted a lease for her residence, stipulating that certain family members, specifically himself, Elaine, and Evan, had the right to frequent access to the property for family gatherings and required visitations. The lease was dated and signed with Martin's signature, but it didn't include Kate's signature. It also included no tenant information, no rent amount, no terms of termination. It was, in essence, a document her father had created to declare ownership of her property, and he'd slid it through her mail slot in the middle of the night, presumably hoping she'd wake up to it and somehow consider herself legally bound. The second document came 2 days later. Kate discovered it in her mailbox. This one appeared to be from the county tax assessor, but something about it didn't look quite right. The paper quality was slightly off. The typeface didn't match standard government correspondence. With trembling hands, Kate pulled up the county website and called the tax assessor's office. The woman who answered confirmed Kate's suspicion. This document was counterfeit. Someone had created a fake tax assessment letter claiming that the property at 847 Birchwood Lane qualified for a homestead exemption on the grounds that it was the primary residence of a dependent elderly care facility operated by the Whitaker family. The fake letter recommended a massive tax reduction. Someone had put significant effort into this forgery. Someone, and Kate was certain it was her father, had created false government documents to establish a fraudulent claim on her property. Kate printed everything. She printed the fake lease, the counterfeit tax documents, the security footage showing her father on her property at 2:47 a.m. She also printed her phone records, her email records, and every notice she'd sent to her family. She placed all of it in a file and took it directly to Aaron's office. "This is escalating," Aaron said, reading through the documents. Aaron's professional demeanor hadn't changed, but Kate could see something harden in her attorney's expression. "This is no longer family conflict. This is fraud. This is forgery of government documents. This is trespassing. We need to involve law enforcement." They filed a report with the local police department. They filed a report with the tax assessor's office. They sent cease and desist letters to Martin and Elaine Whitaker, instructing them to cease all attempts to gain fraudulent access to the property, all fraudulent filing of documents, and all trespassing on the premises. The letters promised legal action if these activities continued. They also notified Evan and Lily that similar actions had been documented and would be pursued legally if Evan engaged in any similar attempts to fraudulently access or claim ownership of the property. But the most devastating discovery came when Erin did a deeper investigation into the family finances. What she found was a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond the house. There were signs that Martin had been using his children's identities for financial purposes, opening accounts in their names, taking out loans, claiming tax deductions for dependents who no longer lived at home. This wasn't new behavior. This was a pattern that likely extended back years. Kate had just been the first to put a structure, a legal LLC, a property deed in her name, a boundary, in place that he couldn't easily control or manipulate. "I need to tell you something," Erin said, and her voice had shifted into a gentler register. "Your father's behavior, what we're documenting here, this goes beyond domineering or controlling. This is predatory. He's treating his children like extensions of his financial portfolio. He's treating their identities and their assets as things he's entitled to use. That's not just family dysfunction. That's criminal." Kate felt something break inside her that day, not in a traumatic way, but in a clarifying way. For 32 years, she had operated under the assumption that her parents' controlling behavior was normal, that their invasiveness was a sign of love, that their exploitation of her identity and resources was just how families worked. She'd only slowly come to understand that this was not universal. Not every parent treated their child's autonomy as a threat. Not every parent responded to boundaries with fraud and forgery. She had been telling herself for years that she was being ungrateful by protecting her property, being selfish by creating distance. What she was actually doing was protecting herself from theft. The conversation with Lily happened the week after the cease and desist letter was sent. Lily appeared at Kate's house on a Saturday morning, heavily pregnant now, visibly distressed. Kate considered not opening the door, but Lily had always been kind to her. Lily had never participated in the intrusion and invasion. So Kate opened the door, without the chain, which was a deliberate choice, and let her sister-in-law inside. They sat in Kate's kitchen, surrounded by boxes she still hadn't unpacked, and Lily laid out what she'd learned. Elaine had been using family pressure to justify the actions against Kate's house. She'd been telling Evan that all of this was about family loyalty, about not abandoning their parents in their old age, about ensuring the parents could visit their daughter. The implication was that Kate was being cold, selfish, destructive to the family unit. Lily had been trying to stay out of it, but Evan was increasingly caught between his wife and his family, and he was starting to believe the narrative his parents had constructed. Lily came to Kate to tell her this because Lily was pregnant with Evan's child, and Lily understood that Evan's family history of boundary crossing and manipulation and financial predation was likely to replicate in his own family if something didn't change. "I need you to understand something," Kate said to Lily, and she chose her words very carefully. "Your baby is going to be born into a family structure that has operated on invasion and boundary erosion for generations. Your baby is going to have grandparents who believe they have the right to access, control, and manipulate. That's not something you can prevent through politeness or accommodation, but what you can do is refuse to participate. You can establish boundaries with your own family that are firm enough that your child understands that boundaries are real and respected. The clearest way to teach your child that her bodily autonomy matters, that her belongings matter, that her right to say no matters, is to watch you practice those principles with your own family. I'm not doing this to punish Evan. I'm doing this to protect myself and, honestly, to model something different for the next generation. I'm doing this so that your child doesn't grow up thinking this is normal." Lily started crying. Through the tears, she said, "I understand. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I didn't stand up to them faster. I was trying to keep the peace. But keeping the peace by allowing fraud and trespassing isn't peace. It's just enabling." She paused, placing her hand on her belly. "I'm going to talk to Evan. I'm going to make sure he understands what's actually happening here. And I'm going to make sure our baby knows that she has an aunt who's brave enough to say no." The investigation expanded from there. The tax assessor's office began looking into the fraudulent documents. The police department opened a case. Aaron brought in forensic accountants who traced through decades of Martin Whitaker's financial manipulations, discovering a pattern so consistent and so extensive that it suggested this was how he'd always operated. It appeared that most of Martin's wealth came not from brilliant business decisions, but from creative financial predation of his family members. It appeared that Whitaker Industries itself might be built on that foundation. It appeared that what Kate was calling out was not an exception to the family's normal operation, but rather the normal operation itself, finally visible because she'd created a structure it couldn't penetrate. The paper trail that her parents had created, the documents they'd forged, the false notices they'd sent, the trail cam footage of her father committing trespassing, became the evidence that would eventually bring criminal charges. Kate had done this not by confronting them aggressively, not by escalating to violence, not by public humiliation. She'd done it by creating documentation, maintaining boundaries, and refusing to participate in the narrative that her family's needs trumped her own right to safety and autonomy. The invisible hands had left tracks. And once tracks are visible, you can follow them anywhere. The holidays arrived that year with a different feeling than any previous holiday. Kate had spent every previous Christmas, every previous Thanksgiving, every previous family gathering performing a role. The dutiful daughter, the one who absorbed the implicit criticisms, who deflected the invasive questions about her relationship status and her career choices, who laughed at jokes that were designed to demean her, who accepted money from her parents and understood it came with implicit strings attached. This year, she'd made the decision to not perform that role. She'd sent an email to her immediate family in early November. She would not be attending holiday gatherings at her parents' house. If they wished to see her, they were welcome to visit her home. She would provide appropriate notice and boundaries for those visits. Otherwise, she would be spending the holidays with her chosen family, Mrs. Porter, her neighbor who'd been unexpectedly supportive, Jamie, her closest friend since college, and a few other people who'd stood by her through the property dispute. The holiday dinner at her house was scheduled for December 22nd. Kate had invited 7 people. It was going to be small and intentional, carefully constructed to feel nothing like the mandatory family obligations she'd endured for 32 years. 2 days before that dinner, everything changed. Evan called her around midnight. He was crying, actually crying, in a way that adult men in her family rarely did. "Kate," he said, "I think I'm making a terrible mistake. I've been listening to Dad. I've been believing his version of things. And I just discovered that he's been using my identity for financial purposes for years. For actual years. And I realized I have no idea what he's used it for, what accounts exist in my name, what he's done. And I realized you tried to tell me that this was happening, and I didn't listen, because I didn't want to believe Dad was that person. I didn't want to believe that someone who raised me would do that. But he did. And you've known all along." Kate let him talk. She didn't interrupt. She didn't say, "I told you so," though she thought it. She didn't say, "Welcome to the realization that our parents are predatory," though that's what she felt. She just listened to her brother come to terms with the fact that his entire understanding of his family had been built on a foundation of manipulation and fraud. "I want to make this right," Evan said. "I want to support you. I want to tell everyone what Dad's actually done. I want to be honest about this instead of covering it up." "Okay," Kate said quietly. "If that's what you want to do, we need to talk to Aaron about the best way to do that. There are legal considerations here. You'll need to protect yourself. But I hear you. I believe you. And I'm glad you're seeing the truth now." She expected her parents to respond with some kind of public performance, some kind of narrative control exercise. She did not expect them to show up at her house on Christmas Eve. Kate was preparing for her holiday dinner, arranging flowers in vases, baking bread, trying to create an atmosphere that felt warm but boundaried, celebratory but controlled. When the doorbell rang at 4 p.m. on Christmas Eve, she knew before she opened the door that it was them. She knew because this was exactly the kind of move her mother made, arriving without announcement, without permission, at a time when Kate would presumably be too busy or too hospitable to turn her away. Kate opened the door on the chain this time. Always the chain. Behind the chain, she could see her parents on her porch. Her mother was visibly distressed, her face blotchy in the way it got when she'd been crying. Her father was holding a thick manila envelope, the same kind of envelope Kate had seen before, the same kind that had contained forged documents and false leases. But there was something different about his posture. He looked diminished somehow, as if the events of the past months had aged him significantly. "May we come in?" her mother asked. The voice was small. This was not her mother's boardroom voice, not her mother's social performance voice. This was something else. "You should have called," Kate said. "You should have asked. You should have respected the boundaries I've established." "You're right," her father said. His voice was rough, as if it hadn't been used in a while. "You're completely right. We violated every request you made. We violated your privacy, your property, and your autonomy. And I came here to try to make some kind of apology for that, though I understand now that an apology might not be sufficient. Kate hesitated. For her entire life, she'd been taught that family came first, that reconciliation was always necessary, that maintaining the family unit superseded everything else. She'd been raised to accept apologies she didn't believe, to forgive violations that were designed to be repeated, to prioritize connection over self-protection. But she was learning, slowly and painfully, that these teachings had been designed to keep her compliant. They had been designed to ensure she never created boundaries her parents couldn't navigate. "You need to leave," Kate said. "And you need to leave now. You can call Aaron Walsh's office during business hours and discuss this through legal counsel. But you cannot show up at my home without permission. You cannot expect that I'll receive you simply because you've decided that reconciliation is necessary. You cannot treat my boundaries as suggestions." Her mother's eyes filled with tears. Real tears. Or the performance of real tears. Kate wasn't sure anymore if she could distinguish the difference. "I'm sorry," Elaine said. "I'm so sorry. I want to know my daughter. I want my grandchildren to know their grandmother. I want my family back." "The family you want is the one where I don't have boundaries," Kate said. "Where I accept your involvement in every decision I make. Where I give you access to my home and my money and my identity because you raised me, and you feel that creates an obligation. I don't accept those terms. So the family you want doesn't exist. What exists instead is this. You are my parents, and I love you, which is different from wanting you in my home. You can have contact with me through scheduled, boundaried visits. You can have communication with me through email, but you cannot have access. You cannot have the kind of intimacy and violation of privacy you had before." Something shifted in her mother's face. For just a moment, Kate saw her mother see her, really see her, for perhaps the first time in Kate's adult life. Not as a character in a story her mother was telling about family success and gratitude, but as a person, as a separate being with her own interior life and her own right to self-determination. "I understand," Elaine said. "I don't like it, but I understand." The envelope that her father had brought contained, oddly, a copy of the original deed to the childhood home Kate had grown up in. The deed bore both her father's name and her grandmother's name, Kate's paternal grandmother, who'd passed away when Kate was 12. Tucked into the envelope was also a handwritten note from her father. The note was brief. It read, "This house raised you. It made you into the person you are. I tried to replicate that with my house, but I did it wrong. I tried to control you instead of letting you become yourself. I'm sorry. The person you're becoming is someone to be proud of. I just hope I can learn to step back far enough to see it." Kate kept the note. She didn't frame it. She didn't post it on social media to perform some kind of family reconciliation narrative. She kept it in a drawer, and sometimes when she was feeling uncertain about the choices she'd made, she read it and reminded herself that change was possible, that growth was possible, even in people who demonstrated a lifetime of controlling behavior. But she also didn't lose her vigilance. She continued to maintain her cameras. She continued to document communications. She continued to assert her boundaries clearly and consistently. Because understanding that her father had done damage and actually changing the family dynamic were two different things. Understanding that her mother wanted reconciliation and believing that reconciliation would look like actual change were two different things. Trust, Kate had learned, was not something that could be rebuilt through a handwritten note. Trust was something that had to be earned through behavior, consistently, over time. That Christmas Eve, after her parents left, Kate locked her door. The new lock, the one she controlled, and she called Jamie. "They showed up," Kate said, without preamble. "My parents just showed up at my house." "Are you okay?" Jamie's voice was immediate and protective. This was the difference between chosen family and biological family. Chosen family asked how you were doing. Chosen family didn't assume you owed them anything. "I'm okay," Kate said. "I maintained the boundary. They left. But Jamie, I'm tired. I'm tired of having to be on guard. I'm tired of having to defend my own right to my own home. I'm tired of having to document everything like I'm preparing for some kind of legal proceeding with my own parents." "I know," Jamie said quietly. "But here's what matters. You did it. You stood firm. You didn't let guilt or obligation or family mythology change your response. You protected yourself. And that's everything." Mrs. Porter brought a pie over an hour later. She didn't ask what had happened. She just set the pie down and sat with Kate in silence for a while. Eventually, Mrs. Porter said, "You know what I've learned in 67 years? Some people raise children to be their possession. Other people raise children to be people. Your parents were the first kind, but you're becoming the second kind. For yourself, if nothing else, that takes courage." The chosen family dinner on December 22nd happened as planned. 7 people, all of whom had chosen to show up, all of whom respected Kate's right to boundaries, all of whom understood that family didn't have to be biological. They sat around Kate's dining table, her dining table, in her house, on her terms, and they shared food and stories and the kind of laughter that didn't require performance. Mrs. Porter brought roasted vegetables. Jamie brought wine. Another friend brought dessert. And Kate brought herself, fully, authentically, without the need to manage anyone else's expectations or emotions. For the first time in her adult life, Christmas felt like home. It took 6 months for the criminal charges to be officially filed. The fraud case was more straightforward. The forged tax documents provided a clear paper trail. The trespassing charge was simpler. But the identity theft charge, which was the most significant one, required months of forensic accounting and legal review. During that time, Evan became the state's primary witness. He assisted in identifying every account his father had fraudulently opened in his name, every false document, every unauthorized financial transaction. It was devastating for him to publicly acknowledge that his father had been using his identity as a tool for his own enrichment. But he did it anyway, and Kate understood that Evan's choice to tell the truth was itself a form of boundary setting, a form of refusal to participate in the family's protective myths. The tax assessor's office closed their investigation with a finding that someone had deliberately created fraudulent documents. Charges were referred to the district attorney. The police department filed their report. And very quietly, without public announcement or family drama, Martin Whitaker was arrested on charges of identity theft, fraud, and forgery. Kate did not attend the trial. She didn't feel the need to sit in a courtroom and watch her father face the consequences of his actions. She'd already faced the consequences, already survived them, already moved through them. What mattered now was not vindication, but continuation. What mattered was building a life that was actually hers, structured according to her own values, protected by boundaries she'd deliberately constructed. Her mother stopped posting on Facebook. This was notable because Elaine Whitaker had used Facebook as her primary instrument of social performance for 15 years. Its absence was a kind of surrender. It was an acknowledgement that the narrative she'd been constructing, the one about the grateful, successful daughter and the devoted elderly parents, had collapsed. It was an acceptance that sometimes families didn't work the way you wanted them to, and that acceptance, though painful, was its own kind of freedom. Elaine requested a visit in August, 9 months after the events at the house had begun. Kate agreed to one supervised visit, though she phrased it as a coffee meeting rather than anything more formal. They met at a cafe not far from Kate's office, and for the first time, Kate's mother asked her questions about her life without already knowing the answers. She asked about Kate's work in brand risk management. She asked about Kate's plans for her career. She asked, without accusation or judgment, what Kate's life actually looked like now that she'd established boundaries. Kate answered honestly, but briefly. She was building a career she was proud of. She was learning to trust her own judgment about what belonged in her life and what didn't. She was developing friendships that were based on mutual respect rather than obligation. She was learning what it meant to make autonomous decisions without requiring family approval. "I'm proud of you," Elaine said, and Kate didn't know how to respond to that. For most of her life, her mother's pride had felt like a weapon. Another reason to maintain the family's image, to protect the family's reputation, to subordinate her own needs to collective ones. But maybe, Kate thought, maybe her mother actually meant it this time. Maybe her mother was finally seeing her daughter as a separate person rather than a reflection of herself. Kate didn't say, "I love you." She wasn't ready for that yet, but she didn't say anything hostile either. She just sat with her mother in the cafe and let the separation between them exist without trying to bridge it. By autumn, Kate had changed one thing about her house. She'd taken the key her mother had given her at the denouement of this entire story, the key from her childhood home, and she'd placed it on a shelf in her living room. Not displayed prominently, just sitting there, visible only if you knew to look for it. It was a reminder of where she came from. It was also a reminder of why she'd left. It was also a reminder that you could love where you came from and still need to leave it. You could acknowledge that a place had raised you, and also understand that staying there would require you to shrink yourself into a smaller version of who you were meant to be. The house at 847 Birchwood Lane continued to be just a house, physically. It had the same hardwood floors, the same wraparound porch, the same architectural bones, but it had become something else entirely. It had become a place where one person's boundaries were respected without question, where one person's autonomy was protected without compromise, where one person's right to self-determination was honored completely. Elaine had once told Kate that a house was a place that knew your name. She'd meant it spiritually, metaphorically, in that particular way that parents speak when they're trying to create meaning out of square footage and mortgage payments. But Kate had learned that this was partially true. A house did know your name. Your house knew whether you answered to your own needs or whether you subordinated them to others' requirements. Your house knew whether you kept your doors locked against the people who'd raised you. Your house knew whether you chose isolation or freedom, and whether you could tell the difference. On Kate's first anniversary of closing, she threw a small party. Jamie was there. Mrs. Porter was there. Erin Walsh came, bringing wine. Even Lily came, now visibly into her third trimester, glowing with the particular kind of anticipation that comes before you bring a new person into the world. Kate had wanted Lily there because she wanted Lily's child to have an example of what boundaries looked like, what protection of yourself looked like, what it looked like when a woman said no and meant it and didn't apologize for it. They stood on Kate's porch, the same porch where her father had attempted to establish fraudulent ownership, the same porch where her mother had shown up unannounced, the same porch where Deputy Rivera had confirmed the legal reality of Kate's solitude. And Kate raised a glass. "Here's to houses," she said, "that know exactly whose name they're supposed to know. Here's to locks that work. Here's to doors that can be closed. Here's to boundaries that hold. Here's to the people who chose to be family, who didn't have to be, who showed up anyway. Here's to understanding that home isn't always about blood. Here's to understanding that home is about safety. Here's to understanding that home is sometimes about solitude, but it's a solitude that you chose, and that makes all the difference." They clinked glasses on the porch, and the sound echoed into the autumn evening, and Kate felt something settle inside her. Not quite peace, but something close to it. Something like the feeling of a door closing softly behind you, knowing that you'll be the only one to open it again. Her mother would eventually understand what Kate had built. It might take years. It might take the experience of Kate's boundaries being repeatedly honored, repeatedly sustained, repeatedly non-negotiable. It might even require Elaine to look at her own life and wonder whether she'd been given the same opportunity, whether someone had shown her that it was possible to create space between yourself and your family without destroying the family bond entirely. But that was no longer Kate's responsibility. That was no longer something Kate needed to fix or facilitate or manage. Kate had learned, through the course of this entire ordeal, that there was a profound difference between loyalty and complicity. There was a difference between respecting your family and allowing them to violate you. There was a difference between love and erasure. And more than anything else, Kate had learned that the most important love she could practice was love directed toward herself. The most important boundary she could establish was the one that protected her right to exist as herself, fully and without apology. The house at 847 Birchwood Lane was just a building, but it had become a teacher. It had taught Kate that she was worth protecting. It had taught her that her boundaries mattered. It had taught her that saying no was an act of self-respect. It had taught her that sometimes the most courageous thing you could do was close a door against the people who'd raised you and trust that you would be okay on the other side of that door. In the darkness of her house, alone but not lonely, Kate poured herself another cup of coffee. On her laptop, she changed a folder name from Disputes to Resolved. The documents inside, the photographic evidence, the trail cam footage, the email records, the screenshots of her mother's social media posts, remained in perfect order, perfectly preserved. But they were historical now. They were evidence of a conflict that had been survived and overcome. They were proof that boundaries could hold, that truth could emerge, that one person's refusal to participate in their own exploitation could change an entire family dynamic. Outside, the autumn leaves fell from the trees lining Birchwood Lane. Inside, the house held Kate safely in its rooms. Neither of them asked for anything more than that. Neither of them required explanation or justification. They simply existed in their own truth, protected and protecting, locked and loved, known and knowing in return. The house that knows my name, Kate thought. That's exactly what this is. And my name is finally the only name it needs to know. 3 years later, in the spring of Kate's 35th year, her phone rang with a particular kind of urgency that she'd learned to recognize. It was her brother. The message was brief. Lily's in labor. The baby's here. It's a girl. We're naming her Eleanor Kate, after both of our grandmothers and you. We wanted you to be one of the first to know. Kate sat with that news for a long moment. A child had been born into her family, a child who would grow up knowing her father had made choices to protect his autonomy, knowing her grandfather had eventually faced legal consequences for his exploitation, knowing her grandmother had slowly and painfully learned to respect boundaries. This child would grow up in a different family dynamic than the one Kate had grown up in, because Kate's refusal to participate in the old pattern had created space for new patterns to emerge. But more than that, this child was named after Kate. Not as a burden, not as an expectation, but as the acknowledgement of something Kate had done. Kate had protected herself. And in protecting herself, she had modeled something different for the next generation. She had demonstrated that love didn't require erasure of self. She had demonstrated that family connections could be real without being suffocating. She had demonstrated that you could say no to your parents and survive it, could create boundaries and still have relationships, could protect yourself and still be loved. Elaine had begun a slow process of change over the past 3 years. She still sometimes pushed boundaries. She still sometimes forgot that she didn't have the access she'd once had. But she consistently apologized when she caught herself doing it. She consistently respected when Kate said no. She was, in her own way, learning to see her daughter as a person rather than as a possession or a reflection of herself. Martin remained legally entangled with the consequences of his actions. His businesses were being investigated by the state. His reputation in the business community had been fundamentally damaged. More importantly, his relationships with his children were fundamentally changed. Evan had chosen to limit contact. Lily had chosen to protect her child from exposure to his predatory patterns, and Kate had chosen to maintain boundaries that would, she suspected, last for the rest of her life. His actions had consequences, as they should, as they must, if anything is ever going to change. But none of that was Kate's responsibility anymore. She had protected herself. She had created boundaries. She had refused to participate in a system designed to exploit her. And in doing so, she had not only saved herself, she had created a possibility for change in her entire family system. The new baby, Eleanor Kate, would grow up knowing that boundaries were real and respected. She would grow up seeing her aunt maintain those boundaries. She would grow up in a world where the old patterns had been exposed and disrupted. Kate bought a small gift to bring to the hospital. A mobile, made of wood and felt, hanging delicate shapes that moved with the air. On one of the hanging shapes, Kate had written her name in careful letters. Eleanor Kate would see her aunt's name, moving gently through the air of her nursery. Eleanor Kate would grow up understanding that aunts were people who protected themselves. Eleanor Kate would grow up understanding that families could be complicated and still be real. Eleanor Kate would grow up understanding that sometimes love looked like a locked door, and sometimes the most important thing you could teach someone was that their boundaries mattered. Kate locked her house, the house that knew her name, before she left for the hospital. She checked the locks twice. This wasn't anxiety anymore. This was simply the particular care that comes from understanding what doors mean, what boundaries mean, what protection means. She was going to meet the newest member of her family. She was going to hand that baby a gift and say a quiet prayer that Eleanor Kate's life would include fewer boundaries to establish, fewer violations to overcome, fewer betrayals to survive. She was going to hope that because Kate had refused to participate, because Kate had created barriers, because Kate had stood firm and documented and defended and protected, because Kate had done all of that, Eleanor Kate might grow up in a family where respect for boundaries was the normal default instead of a revolutionary act. The door clicked shut behind her. The locks engaged. The house sat quiet in its ownership, perfectly and completely known by the person who lived there. And Kate drove toward the hospital, toward her brother, toward Lily, toward the baby named after her, toward whatever came next. She was no longer running from her family. She was running toward her life. And that made all the difference.